Hello and welcome. This is Microsoft Flight Simulator and this is the Phoenix Airbus A320. Now, in one of my recent videos, someone asked a very simple question, and that question was, when do you usually switch off the autopilot? And to my surprise, this sparked a very lively and lengthy debate about different opinions if and when you should switch off the autopilot. And so I thought, well, let's make a video about it. Let's have that discussion. And so we'll be looking at different scenarios, at different factors, and of course we'll discuss when it is a good idea to switch off the autopilot early and when it is obviously a very bad idea. So let's talk about it. Okay, let's get started. So here it is, the magic button, Autopilot 1, Autopilot 2. You are probably aware that usually shortly after takeoff we switch on the autopilot, particularly at busy airports or when we fly complex SIDs and departure routes. So this usually comes on fairly quickly after takeoff. But when should you switch it off? Well, this is when it gets a bit tricky. So first of all, Airbus always tells us to use the appropriate amount of automation to make our life as easy as possible. That's sort of the philosophy in terms of how much automation you should use. This of course is a very guarded statement. I imagine statements like this are usually written by lawyers. But anyway, the idea is that you should use the appropriate amount of automation to take as much workload away from you as the pilot. Now, this does not negate your responsibility. Even Airbus says, ultimately it is the pilot who is responsible for the safe conduct of the flight. So you need to decide when is it appropriate and when is it not appropriate to fly manually. On top of that, you will be flying for a company, and companies have their own procedures. We've discussed this in one of my other videos recently, and there are different philosophies. I know there are companies out there that basically say you do not switch off the autopilot until you're just before minimum, and then and only then do you switch it off and just carry on with the rest of the flight. Essentially, you just do a flare and a landing, and that's it. Now, I'm sure these companies have reasons for this, they have had experiences, but also it depends on the operations you do. The company I fly for essentially says you can switch off the autopilot whenever you want, but if you screw up the approach, then you better have a good explanation at hand why that happened. So it's left up to us, it's left up to our judgment. But that also means you take full responsibility for what happens afterwards. So which one of these philosophies makes more sense? And that was essentially the discussion we had in the comments section. I think it really depends on the company you work for. So if you fly a long-haul aircraft like an A380, that means you usually only fly into big airports, big international airports. 99% of the time you'll be flying in ILS, and that is usually flown by the autopilot because it just does a much better job than we do as pilots. However, the company I fly for is very different. So we have a huge variety of destinations in our route network, and therefore I think it really depends on the situation. So to give an example, we sometimes fly into small airports, many of them are on Greek islands, and they simply do not have an approach. There is nothing. On the approach chart you are simply being taken to a point over the sea, and from there you need to make your own way to the runway. These runways are usually very short, very narrow. A lot of them are only 30 meters wide, which is the minimum for the A320. And I don't know why, but whenever I fly there, it's always really, really windy, often with winds gusting 41 knots. If you are not used to flying manually, you are going to struggle to fly into these airports. So you need to practice, because you have almost 200 people behind the cockpit door, and they trust that you know what you're doing and that you are capable of flying this kind of approach. So at least for the kind of operation I am flying, I think it is very important to have manual flying as part of your toolkit and to be comfortable with it. Switching off the autopilot will always increase your workload, but it should not increase it to a level where you're just unable to do anything else. You should be comfortable with this. I mean, at the end of the day, you are a pilot. You get paid to fly and not to be flown. Now, having said all this, I can tell you that once in a while, even if you do not fly into some small Greek island airports, you will also have to fly approaches manually. I've had this happen to me 3 times now, where the airport told us that the ILS was not available because usually it's being calibrated or there's some maintenance, and the VOR DME that you need for a non-precision approach was also not available. So the only option left was either a circling approach or a visual approach, which once again cannot be flown with autopilot. So these situations occur in the real world, and then you need to be perfectly comfortable to just switch everything off and fly the aircraft manually to the runway. And this brings us back to normal operations. Is it appropriate then to switch off the autopilot early, to practice, to be comfortable, to essentially don't forget your flying skills? Well, again, I think this really depends. So if I would fly an approach into a small airport, it's a beautiful sunny day, it is quiet, I'm the only aircraft on the radio, then why not? Why not switch off the autopilot at 10,000 feet and just make my way to the airport visually? On the other hand, I also fly into airports like London Heathrow, and here this makes absolutely no sense. Heathrow has a huge amount of traffic. Both pilots and air traffic controllers are always very busy. The workload is very high. The last thing you want to do is increase your workload by switching off the autopilot early. So here I usually keep it on until I'm just before minimum, switch it off and perform a manual landing, and that's it. So you can see there are a few things you need to consider. First of all, when is it appropriate to switch off the autopilot? Can I deal with the additional workload introduced by that, or will it reach a level where it can become safety relevant? And this, of course, is not only if you are flying into a busy airport. Now, you may be flying into a small airport with no traffic, but you may be tired. This may be the 4th sector of the day. You've flown for 6 days in a row, you had early shifts, late shifts, you're just a bit tired, and you're already struggling to fully concentrate. Again, is it really appropriate to switch off the autopilot early? I would say no. And this is the way you have to navigate your way through this question as a pilot. Again, if you work for an airline that has specific rules that tell you you are never to switch off the autopilot just at 10,000 feet, then of course the decision is taken away from you. But if you are flying for an airline like the one I do, that leaves it up to you, then of course they trust your judgment. And that judgment encompasses pretty much everything. Are you tired? Are you fit? Is the situation appropriate? Do you expect anything on the approach, like VFR traffic? Are there gliders around, as is sometimes the case at some of the airports? What are the conditions of the runway like, etc., etc., etc.? So you need to take all these things into account, and you need to decide whether it is appropriate to do this or not. So, tricky topic really, tricky. We haven't even touched on abnormals. That of course is another topic. There are certain abnormals where you will lose the autopilot, and you will lose it whenever that happens. So it could be that you lose your autopilot at 35,000 feet. And then from that moment on, you will be flying manually all the way to the airport. Again, you must be able to do this. You are in control of the aircraft. You are responsible for all passengers and crew members on board. So there we are. That's essentially the discussion we had in a nutshell. And again, I don't want to preach. I don't want to tell you what to do or what I think is right or wrong. All I can tell you is how it works best for me with the route network I am exposed to. And yeah, I mean, if you have a different opinion, let me know. To sum up, all I can tell you is this. My personal philosophy is this. If I fly into Heathrow, Frankfurt, whatever, yeah, of course, leave the autopilot on. Do what ATC tells you to do. When you reach minimum, switch it off, perform a manual landing, done. It makes it easier for everyone. If it's a nice sunny day, I feel fresh, relaxed, there's nobody else on the frequency, I fly into a small airport somewhere, yeah, sure, switch it off, practice a bit your hand flying, because the day will come when you have this Greek island or maybe Innsbruck in your roster, and then you need to be fit to do that. I've flown into Innsbruck during föhn storms, I've flown into Salzburg during thunderstorms, and you know, you are expected to be able to do this. You are the pilot, you are in charge. So I personally try to practice manual flying once in a while. It also comes down to confidence. If you do manual flying once in a while, it increases your confidence in doing so, makes you feel more comfortable with the whole thing, and then when the day comes when you have to do it, maybe in some bad weather, and you switch off the autopilot, you don't really feel uncomfortable, or it doesn't really bother you that much. And that makes a big difference in terms of how you feel about your situation. So yeah, that's really all I want to say about this topic. But I mean, I don't know, let's have a conversation about it in the comments section. Maybe you have a completely different view. Maybe your experience is different to mine. I just thought it was a really interesting topic. It was something I never really thought would cause a huge debate and discussion. So I thought, okay, let's talk about it. Let's make a short video. Let's have this debate. And that's it. That's already it. I hope you found this somewhat interesting. Maybe I gave you some food for thought. That would be great. And yeah, once again, I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Until then, all the best. Bye bye.